everyone and welcome. It's Noreen here today, and I'm delighted to have been invited to do a guest design video and post for the W+9 blog. I have long been inspired by Dawn's painting talent, and I love using her floral stamps to try and imitate her style. It's still a few days before the holidays are officially underway, but my cards today are taking a break from all things seasonal. So these are the cards I'm going to show you today. I used a couple of blooms from the Modern Anemones stamp set, the big bloom and two of the leaf images from the Modern Peonies, and then some of the small leaf designs from the Watercolor Anemones set. I began by cutting a piece of post-it paper and stamping each of the designs onto there and then cutting them out. Besides the obvious use of post-it paper for masking, I like to cut the individual pieces out and use them to create my arrangement before I start inking and stamping. So now I begin stamping my floral design. I'm using Canson XL cold press watercolor paper, and I'm referencing off camera the photo that I took of my original post-it arrangement. I'm not going to worry about the flowers being anchored to each other with stems, even though the stamp sets do include stem images. And the reason for that is I'm planning to fill in the background gaps with pen-drawn squiggles and vines. Watercolor and ink is my favorite style of artistic painting, and I'm not going for realism with this, which is why you won't see me doing any no-line coloring anytime soon, because I like outlines, and lots of them. And as I said, I'm going for more of an artistic effect than realism. After adding the leaves to the arrangement, I'm ready to start painting. I begin by laying down a very pale undercoat of color for each of the blossoms and the blooms, as well as the leaves. The anemones look like I'm using a pale yellow, but it's actually closer to a sandy peach. And then the peony is getting an undercoat color that's closer to a true pink. I find that by doing this, adding the undercoat of color, that it adds a depth of shades to the final painting. And when I go back and add more layers of color, I don't worry about covering the bottom layer perfectly to the edges. I just blob the color on here and there in places so that the layers of color actually show after they dry. I do a couple of petals at a time on each flower, moving around frequently so that the petals don't all run together, and ultimately so that the petals all have a slightly differing shade one from another because of dipping into neighboring paint colors to augment my original puddle of color. For the petals furthest to the back of the flower, I use more intense color because they're shaded by the petals above them. I use more pigmented mix of paint and water to get that darker shade, and I lay it down right into the V where the upper petals meet. Then I clean my brush of paint and come back with it still slightly wet and paint with water, as it were, from the edge of the petal towards the paint. That will allow the color to naturally wick outwards in a lovely gradient wash. After the first layers of paint have mostly dried, I'll come back in with a darker shade of my color, knowing that 1, it's going to dry back lighter, and 2, because it needs a higher contrast so that it doesn't all end up looking like one indistinguishable blob of color. My color palette for this card panel is tending towards antique shades of rose, I think that's a word, by using a diluted rust shade for the anemones and more of a plummy shade of rose for the peony. So I've skipped ahead with my peony painting, but you can see what I was saying about coming back in with a much darker shade for the final layer, just to add some depth and definition. And for the leaves, I used all the colors. I started with some greens, added some blues and some browns, and then I go back and add yet more to those shades while the original paint is still wet. I find this is a good time to clean up the dried paint bits in my palette tin because blends of muddy shades will often surprise you and make the loveliest antique tints of color. And introducing a new shade to a spot that's still wet will allow some really beguiling blends to dry out. So now I come back in with some brown paint just to add in the tips of the stamens and fill in the centers a little bit. Not too much that's magic about that. But maybe now is a good time to address the name of these flowers. Does anybody else have as tough a time getting out the word anemone as I do? I read anemone, and so often it comes out anemone. Yeah, let's just leave that. So now I'm coming in with a big soft brush, not quite a mop brush, but sort of a little bit. And I'm using lots of water and more of the same shades that I used on the leaves. And I'm painting in a background wash. I don't worry overly if I go over the edges of the flower petals or leaves. It really won't show or matter. And I just build up a few layers of very pale color. So now this is a fun part. Before the background wash is completely dry, I use the little leaf stamps from the Watercolor Anemones set and 4 colors of Tim Holtz Distress inks: antique linen, shabby shutters, iced spruce, and old paper. And I'm going to use them to stamp around the various leaf stamps randomly with each of the 4 inks and layer them below and behind the outline leaves and the flowers. Where the watercolor paper is still wet, the inked images will bleed in a really beautiful way because of the qualities of the Tim Holtz ink being water-based, and the ultimate result is very faded and indistinct. I just love that look. And then the stamped leaves added once the paper is dry will have crisper edges. Now for my very favorite part. Using a Sharpie marker, I sort of outline the leaves that I've added. I say sort of because it's not a full solid outline for the shape of each leaf. Rather, it's partial and wobbly. It doesn't stick to the actual outlines in every case. It's adding definition here and there, and sometimes even just suggesting form where there isn't any. As well, I'll add some curly tendril vines here and there, and finally go back over some of the lost lines from the original stamped images. Not every petal or outline, just a few here and there. And now for my other favorite part, adding splatters. I'm using indigo blue, some of the greens, and the rust that I've already used on the painting. Now to turn this into a card, I'm using the Hello Dear Friend sentiments from the Doodle Buds stamp set. I am stamping it on vellum with onyx black VersaFine ink and heat embossing with clear embossing powder. Then I'm folding my A2 size card base in half and just lining things up so that I can tear my vellum paper into a rather organic form shape and laying that on the bottom of the card, just folding the edges back to the back side and taping it all down. Now we're into the home stretch of this card's assembly. I'm using some good strong double-sided adhesive to adhere the card panel that I had die cut with a stitched edge die to the card front, and adding a few raindrop gems to the front of this card, and it's pretty much finished. Thanks again to Dawn and the W+9 team for the invitation to be a guest designer this month. I love using your products, and I'm always happy for an opportunity to share what I love to make. And thank you to everybody who watched today.